Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founders are the delegates to the First Continental Congress from New York. Yes, we are continuing our discussion and moving south, or technically west, from Connecticut to New York to discuss the delegates to the First Continental Congress. And New York is a special case because New York has nine, count them, nine delegates, the most sent to the First Continental Congress, which is fascinating because it was in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania only sent 8 people. We'll get to Pennsylvania soon. As for the people of New York, now before we start discussing these gentlemen, we should take some context. Now, our last several videos have been about the New England states, and New York is a very interesting place in the American founding. It's not quite New England, but it's certainly not the South, and it's not even Pennsylvania. It's pretty well associated with New Jersey, but New York 150 years earlier was New Netherlands. And although it had been over a century since the English took over New York, it still had many Dutch traditions that it just could not get over. For example, New York had a feudal system. It was a manor system. There were literal lords of the manor of New York that owned all the property and rented it out to white people. And while there was certainly slavery in New York, it was more along the lines of that in New England than that of the South, though all of the people were there were a small elite property class existed. Most of the people in New York rented their property, with the exception of cities, notably Albany and New York City. But what I have here are the gentlemen being sent from the locations north to south. So we're going to start with John Haring and, to a degree, Henry Wisner, because Haring and Wisner both came from Orange County, New York, which is a little bit north. Just north of New York City are Dutchess and Westchester counties, and a little bit north of that is Orange County, and there were many different communities there. Now, Haring in particular, no known image, made his name writing the Orange Town resolutions, not to be confused with Orange County. He lived in a town called Orange Town, and he's the probable author of the resolutions there. At the time leading up to the American Revolution, resolutions were being written all over the colonies by local town meetings and being sent to their representatives in the colonial government to resolve what they expected and outline some of their complaints. And having done this, Haring made a name for himself in the community as a leader in that fashion. Not dissimilar from, I'll pop up Henry Wisner right away. Also, no known image. This is a monument to him in Goshen, New York, which is in the area, the town he was from. Henry Wisner, also with Haring, became a popular leader. Now, Wisner was more of a leader economically in the area. This was kind of frontier land, and he had opened several mills at this point, which were extremely important to the development of the area. Therefore, he defaulted as a leader, and he was sent with Haring to the Continental Congress. Now, you'll notice I'm saying that the county sent them to the Continental Congress, and that is correct. Now, New York is a very interesting case. While most of the colonies in New England, all of the colonies in New England had their colonial assemblies select delegates from within and send them, several places in New York sent delegates straight from the town meetings. And while it was an Orange County meeting of leaders of the separate towns that selected Henry Wisner and John Haring, it's still very interesting to note that the state, or the colonial government, I should say, of New York did not choose these men. They were chose directly by the people who lived in their area, which is fascinating. Now, we're going to get into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 delegates that were all sent by the city and county of New York. Isaac Lowe, Philip Livingston, James Duane, John Jay, and John Asop. So, I am going to pop up. We'll go one at a time. First of all, let's talk about Isaac Lowe. In New York City, even though there was this strong Dutch leadership, there was this elite mannered class. Like I said, literally lord of the manor, as in old-timey feudal Europe. They were leading the show, but New York City was an exception to this rule. It was a separate city, just like Albany, another city, was not technically owned by part of a manor. That being said, because of that, Isaac Lowe was kind of like Sam Adams, not quite from an elite family, but not quite from the rabble. He mixed in both worlds, and that made him an ideal candidate to become a leader of pre-revolutionary New York. And in fact, New York calls together a provincial congress just after the royal governor shuts down the colonial assembly. Now, it's often called the Committee of 51, though it does change names throughout these years. But Isaac Lowe is elected as the first member of the Committee of 51, which is literally merchants and fairly wealthy people in New York City who come together after the colonial government's been dissolved and form a shadow government, for lack of a better term. And Isaac Lowe was elected the chairman of this. So he is the shadow governor running the shadow government of New York City in particular. It is technically involved with other the whole colony. It is the colonial assembly kind of absolves into this, but like I said, you have people like Wisner and Haring who were chosen directly by their area. Lowe and the rest of the New York City residents are chosen by really the leaders of New York City, although they are also given responsibility to speak on behalf of Dutchess and Westchester County, which are just north of New York City, and Albany, which is a city pretty far north of New York City. All of the delegates from New York City are representing these areas. And the reason for this is there were representatives from these areas who were in New York for the colonial assembly that didn't just run right home, but joined the provincial Congress and the Committee of 51 to, still claim some ownership of the local government. Lowe is an interesting character. So when he arrives at the First Continental Congress, he is essentially the Sam Adams of New York. There are other gentlemen who might make this claim, perhaps Alexander McDougall and a handful of others. But Isaac Lowe really is leading the government. He's a combination of Sam Adams and John Hancock, because John Hancock was really leading Massachusetts at that point. So Lowe shows up. He's a really respected person, and he is important to the fairly radical outcome of the First Continental Congress, which was the colonial assembly. I do want to note, though, that Isaac Lowe does not remain a rebel, and in fact would later go on to become a loyalist, and he would leave North America. I shouldn't say North America. He would leave to Canada after the war's end, though his brother Nicholas Lowe stays around and is a patriot. Again, the American Revolution is very much a civil war. So, to brief a little bit about Isaac Lowe, we are going to move on to some of these other gentlemen. Now, the next name on the list probably should be even higher on this list, Philip Livingston. So, Philip Livingston comes from the Livingston family. His brother, Robert, is Lord of Livingston Manor. So, these nobles, essentially, I'm talking about, he is from New York royalty, almost literally. Philip's really interesting. He's one of the older gentlemen at the First Continental Congress. He, 20 years before this, had been a member of Ben Franklin's Albany Congress, which took place just at the beginning of the French and Indian War, again, 20 years earlier. And the idea was to unite the colonial militias into one unifying force to mutually ensure their defenses, which was an important stepping stone towards what the United States would later become under one banner. So since he was there, Livingston knew a lot of important people from other colonies, which didn't necessarily happen at the time. Even the leaders of colonies liked living in their colonies. They didn't necessarily travel abroad, and by abroad I mean to other colonies. But Livingston knew people from other colonies. He was from one of the, arguably the most important family in New York. Many Livingstons would go on to have important roles throughout the American founding. Livingston, additionally, 10 years before this, went to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City, of course, where he met even more people. So when he shows up to the First Continental Congress, he already knows McKeon and Rodney from Delaware. He already knows Gadsden from South Carolina and Rutledge from South Carolina. He already knows people from Massachusetts. He already knows the soon-to-be former now former royal governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts. He knows these people personally. He has worked with them. Makes him arguably one of the top 2 or 3 most important people at this meeting because of who he knows and where he stands in society. Livingston would go on to sign not only the Continental Association, but would sign the Declaration of Independence. We have a few names on this list that will end up signing the Declaration of Independence. Now, as I said, he's a little bit older, so his role throughout the war and the American founding isn't that much. I don't remember his exact date of death, but he doesn't live all the way through the American founding. Again, he's about Ben Franklin's age, so he's already pretty old at this point. And we're going to move on now from Philip Livingston to James Duane, who's not a member of the Livingston family, but he kind of is. You see, James Duane's parents passed away when he was a preteen, and he needed to finish his education, so he was taken in, not by an orphanage, but by Robert Livingston, Philip, who we were just discussing's older brother, who, as we said, was the Lord of Livingston Manor. So as such, James Duane finished his education, getting a very good education, and becoming an extended, kind of adopted member of the Livingston family. Duane became a lawyer, and he went to New York City, where he became pretty well known for a court case where Trinity Church in New York City, someone started arguing, and the name escapes me, but before the revolution, someone argued, hey, I own that land. Trinity Church should be mine. And even more than Trinity Church, it was the property, the location of the property was very important. And Duane successfully defends Trinity Church for to maintain ownership of this land. Now, this is a little bit controversial. Again, at this point, there was a controversy between the Dutch Reformed Church and Anglican Church in New York because, again, the Dutch heritage, although it had been English for 100 years, was very strong. Many American founders from New York, their first language was Dutch. Even later, Martin Van Buren would not be born until 1782 and be president in the 1830s, and he had Dutch as his first language. That's how ingrained Dutch was to this area. So it was a little bit of a controversial court case, but he became known as a very good lawyer because of it. Was shortly thereafter elected to the state assembly, or again, colonial assembly, and then when that was dissolved, he becomes a member of the Committee of 51, goes to the First Continental Congress. Duane's also interesting after the First Continental Congress because he does sign the Articles of Association. Every member from New York signs the Articles of Association. Duane goes back home for a while. He does not sign the Declaration, but comes back to the Continental Congress and would also sign the Articles of Confederation. Though James Duane is best remembered as the first mayor of New York City after the Revolutionary War ends. Once the British evacuate and the Continental Army stops occupying New York City, which it does for about a year, James Duane takes over as mayor. And it's his job to take New York City, that had been occupied by an enemy army for 8 years and had been first evacuated by patriots and then evacuated by loyalists. And right at the beginning of the war, a third of it burned down. And he was tasked with making New York City into the foremost city in the United States. And within 15, 20 years, it became that. Now, he only serves as mayor for 5 years, but he does an astounding job helping rebound New York City from 2 evacuations and a mass fire. That's really what he's most renowned for. Though, again, we're not getting too much into that. We're really talking about how they got to the First Continental Congress. I probably should have said that at the beginning. We're trying to talk about how they got to the First Continental Congress. Now, after James Duane, we have one of the most famous names in American history, John Jay. Now, you want to look at this list? And tell me which person you think was the most, we'll say, conservative, closest to loyalist, most anti the war breaking out, because the war had not broken out, but anti-violence, wanted to make things better with Great Britain, did not want to stop being British. John Jay. Yes, future first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, acting Secretary of State for a brief time, Governor of New York, creator of the Jay Treaty, very close to George Washington, one of the most important American founders, was New York's least excited First Continental Congress delegate. He was just a young man. He was only in his barely 30 years old when they sent him to the First Continental Congress. And though he was so hesitant for all this, he was from, again, a middling, up-and-coming family that wanted to make its case known, that wanted to prove itself among these elites. And he was doing a very good job of that. He was extraordinarily intelligent. He's there. He goes to the First Continental Congress. Doesn't really like what's going on, but he does agree with everyone else at the convention to sign the Articles of Association. He would go back to New York, and Jay would marry Sarah Livingston Jay, which made him an in-law of who else? The Livingston family. Yes, if you wanted to make it in New York, marrying a Livingston was good. Alexander Hamilton would marry a Schuyler. That's fine. But marrying a Livingston was really where the money was at. Literally. So he does marry into the Livingston family. He ends up becoming a mentor to his much younger brother-in-law, Henry Livingston Jay, who also goes on to serve on the United States Supreme Court. But he would be sent back to the Second Continental Congress. He would leave a little bit early. He wasn't excited about independence, but he did resign himself to it. He leaves before independence, as several people did, and he goes back to New York State to help create New York State. And he essentially writes New York State's constitution, and he essentially creates New York State's government before helping to write Federalist Papers and create the United States government. He also acts as Minister of Foreign Affairs. He travels to Spain for a while, comes back to be Minister of Foreign Affairs. He is really important on the international stage. So we're not going to get too into John Jay, because we could probably talk about John Jay for hours. We could definitely talk about John Jay for hours. Again, not just representing New York City, also representing Albany and Westchester and Dutchess counties just north of the city. Now we are going to talk about the last person from New York City and Westchester, Dutchess, and Albany. John Asop. I believe it's pronounced Asop. Looks like Aesop, like Aesop's Fables. I had people comment when I made a video about him that it was Alsop. That's how they say it in Kentucky. Thank you for letting me know. I'm going to stick with Aesop for now. Anyway, John Asop was not from the wealthiest of families. He did work his way up. Him and his brother started a merchant house in New York City about a decade before the Revolutionary War, and they became really wealthy because he was a merchant. He was one of the angry merchants in New York City, and I should sidebar here that we think of Boston as really sons of liberty and violence and really hostile to what was going on. New York City was a close second. Philly a little bit, and Charleston a little bit. Charleston, I should say more than a little bit, but there were a lot of merchants in New York City, and New York City was up and coming. People kind of realized this is a great spot for a port. And John Asop joins he's elected to the Colonial Assembly. He's then sent to the Committee of 51, who chooses him to go with the rest of this group over to there. Now, Asop, very early on, even before going to the First Continental Congress, was helping arm New York City and supply its troops in case there was a war or something broke out. Because of this, Asop he plays a much smaller role in the First Continental Congress. He is not nearly a Philip Livingston. He does not have that kind of clout. He's about as on the same elite level as John Jay, a lower person trying to break in. And goes to the First Continental Congress, signs the Articles of Association, goes back home, and again continues to help supply and build the New York State militia in preparation for, and then afterward, during the Revolutionary War, once it breaks out. I do want to note, Asop becomes an interesting character. He goes back to the Second Continental Congress and is extraordinarily important to the secret committee, which was in charge of quietly arming George Washington and communicating with other countries for support to arm George Washington. And in fact, it was in his name that the fake company to secure goods from France was put in his name as his company, Messrs. John Alsop and Company. And they're the ones Silas Deane went to France, and that's who Silas Deane was working for. Definitely not being undercover and sending information back to the Americans. Great Britain, don't worry about that. Asop, however, has severe reservations about independence. I said John Jay was arguably the most conservative. Turns out Asop is. Because even though John Jay is not there when they vote for independence in July of 1776, he has resigned himself to it. Asop's there. It doesn't vote for independence and actually resigns his commission and goes back. Now, he does seem to help a little bit supplying the army, but he basically, this is a blemish on his record at a time where honor was above all else. the most important thing in the world. So Asop goes back. He ends up moving to Connecticut. Now, I made a video about him not long ago. I don't believe he was a loyalist, as people might claim he was. He instead retires to Connecticut. But then, after the Revolutionary War ends, when James Duane takes over as mayor of New York City, John Asop returns and becomes very important. He reestablishes the company he and his brother started, and becomes really important to building the wealth of New York City. Also, his only daughter marries Rufus King, who himself is another really important and fascinating founder, though not the topic of today's discussion. Now, we've gotten through what was then upstate New York. We've gotten through New York City. We have two people left, Simon Borr and William Floyd. And much like the people from upstate, they were elected directly by their area. Now, Simon Borr, no known image. It's the only image I could find about him. It's a picture of the gravestone. I sure hope whoever took it is not mad at me for using it. It is not even a great picture. But that's all we get for Simon Borr. You see, Simon Borr was fairly like Henry Wisner. He lived in Brooklyn, New York, or what we now call Brooklyn, New York. Then it was Kings County. Technically, for those of you who don't live in New York, Brooklyn is still called Kings County. That's why it's Brooklyn and Queens. It's Kings and Queens. They just changed the name to Brooklyn along the way. That being said, Simon Borr, if you live in Brooklyn, he's your guy. For the first Continental Congress, Brooklyn. Now, at the time, Brooklyn and New York City were most certainly not the same things. They would not actually become one incorporated entity for over 100, almost 125 years after this. Brooklyn was for a very long time very much its own thing. And Simon Borr had started as a mill operator. He had made some mills, made some money. Eventually, he's appointed as town clerk, and he holds that for about a decade. His town, a very important position, making sure the town's organized. You're not running the town, but you are organizing the town. Town clerk is a position at the time that should not be overlooked. And you know what? Even today should not be overlooked. Thank you, town clerks, for doing all that hard work. Anyway, Borr makes enough of a name for himself in his local community, because at the time, Brooklyn was very small farming towns. Borr was sent to the Colonial Assembly. And very shortly thereafter, that assembly is dissolved, and the first provincial Congress is brought together, aka the Committee of 51. Simon Borr is a part of this, though he is not chosen by that committee to represent New York City. He is actually chosen, again, by the residents of his own town to go and represent them in Philadelphia. Not his own town, I should say county. He is chosen to represent Brooklyn at the First Continental Congress. And he does. And he seems to do a pretty good job. He's one of the more radical people, actually. And he helps overturn the Galloway plan. Now, we'll talk about the Galloway plan more when we talk about Pennsylvania in a few weeks. But suffice to say, Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania came up with a plan to settle everything. And it wasn't radical enough for some people, including Simon Borr, and he becomes one of the people who ends up pushing for the Suffolk Resolves, because halfway through the First Continental Congress, Paul Revere shows up with some resolves written by Joseph Warren in Massachusetts, and it's a lot more radical than the Galloway plan, and it helps push the boycott that eventually happens. So Borr is extremely important for this. Unfortunately, he does get elected to the Second Continental Congress, but he falls ill, and he suffers from an illness for a while, and unfortunately for him, he passes away just about a year after the First Continental Congress, and really has no role in the American founding, which is a shame, because he absolutely would have, as really the face, if not the leader of, the face of Brooklyn during the Revolution. So that's Simon Borr, and we're going to pop back here for our last founder. A founder grew up not far from where I grew up. Long Island's founding father, William Floyd. William Floyd was a leader of Suffolk County. Now, he lived close to the Manor of St. George, which is one of the few manors not named after the person who actually owned it. The Smith family of Long Island. And Long Island now is Smithtown, Smith Road. Smith's Point is a beach right by William Floyd's house, which still stands, and I used to give tour guides at, so I am very partial to William Floyd. That being said, he is one of the few people who, again, because he wasn't a lord, he was an upper elite, and he did things for the lords, because lords generally didn't do anything themselves. They had people do things for them. William Floyd was trusted enough to do these things. He was sent to the Colonial Assembly. Forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but just like many of the men in the Colonial Assembly, when it was dissolved, joined the Committee of 51. Although Floyd didn't actually join the Committee of 51, he was associated with it. He would return to Long Island, and out in Suffolk County, now, there was no Nassau County at the time, it was Queens and Suffolk. William Floyd was elected to represent Suffolk County on Long Island. And a side note here, Long Island, up until this point and through the Revolution, was actually more associated with Connecticut than it was associated with the rest of New York. Much of it had been settled by people from Connecticut just about the time 100 years earlier, where the Dutch were going to be giving it up to England. And it was a major reason England took over, because look, hey, we're already here. And that being said, so William Floyd really doesn't have much attachment to the Dutch history of New York, but he does get sent to the First Continental Congress. He represents specifically Suffolk County. While he's there, he is fairly radical and approves the Articles of Association, as all the rest of New York did. He ends up signing it. He would be elected as a general in the militia, although he doesn't really participate much. William Floyd spends a whole lot of time in Philadelphia throughout the Revolutionary War. He becomes very important as a kind of not a moderate, am I a patriot or am I loyalist? He was very much a patriot, but he became one of the moderate patriots as things break out, and there becomes very partisan politics later on in the First Continental Congress. So he finds himself pretty much in the middle on that. And I do want to note, William Floyd does have his signature on the Declaration of Independence. He would also be an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives, not Senate, House. Unless my mind's failing me, I believe it was the House. He was in the inaugural Congress somewhere, that I assure you. So, this video is a little bit longer than I usually produce, but it's also got a little bit longer list of names than literally any other colony that sent delegates to the First Continental Congress. I do hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned a little something. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, or make sure you come to my live weekly wrap-ups on Thursdays at 8:15 Eastern Standard Time, where really I'm going through the founders of the day I put out in the morning, but I always take questions. So if you have any questions about the First Continental Congress, specifically the delegates from New York, please feel free to come on by. If you're new here, hit like. You've made it pretty far into this video, and definitely subscribe for American Revolution 7 days a week. And I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.